Hello and welcome to Ethical Corporation's webinar on revolutionizing your supply chain through partnerships. Over the next 60 minutes, we will be discussing how to drive large-scale supply chain change through partnerships with WWS, Dell, Philips, and the Responsible Sourcing Network. My name is Karina Amin, and I'm head of US strategy here at Ethical Corporation, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. With us today, we have Marcel Jacobs, Director of Supplier Sustainability at Philips Group Procurement, Melissa Bouilly, Director of Supply Chain Sustainability at Dell, Patricia Jurewicz, Director of Responsible Sourcing Network, and Jeff Malcolm, Director of Private Sector Engagement at WWF. Thanks everyone for joining. Now, to give you an understanding of today's structure, we will start off with a discussion with the four panelists, followed by a Q&A with the audience, where you, the audience, can pitch your questions directly to the speakers. The webinar will focus on market observations and case studies from the panelists, trying to bring out as much of their expertise and knowledge from their backgrounds and the work that they've done. Now, specifically, we will be addressing the following in today's webinar. Number one, where to start with supply chain partnerships. Number two, what the business case looks like in influencing internal stakeholders. Number three, how to identify the right partners. And number four, what the impacts of these partnerships look like. Now, before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this is an interactive discussion. And on the right-hand side, you will see a box where you can post your questions. You can also post questions on Twitter via the hashtag RBSNY, so please do get involved. Excellent. We will now start the discussion for today's webinar. Now, the first question that I'd like to focus on is around looking at the foundations of partnerships from a corporate perspective. And I'd like to first of all bring Marcel and Melissa into the conversation. Marcel, if you could probably start off with where should one start with supply chain partnerships?
Thanks for the introduction, Karina. Good morning, good evening. This is Marcel from Philips. I'm currently based in Eindhoven. A little background, I'm within Group Procurement, responsible for sustainable supply chain, focusing on beyond auditing and responsible sourcing and circular procurement. And to answer the question that Karina raised, the challenge actually is to identify if you look from a risk-based perspective or if you're looking from a differentiator perspective. And what we try to do is moving more towards a differentiator approach, because that means that the internal dialogue that you have with your internal stakeholders is not about cost avoidance, it's not about risk mitigation, it is more about how can you collaborate, how can you make sure that you have business continuity beyond 1 year. So it's really about thinking in the long term, which makes at the end the business case much easier. However, it's still a challenge. It's a challenge to convince internal stakeholders who have still that risk mind or that risk thinking, and also your decision making is in that area. And that's actually the challenge, where we can discuss it a bit further, just as a first answer to the question.
Thanks for that, Marcel. That's really interesting. You know, the fact that you mentioned it's not about risk mitigation, but more about long-term collaboration and business continuity. Melissa, I mean, what are your thoughts here in terms of where should one really start with this whole concept of supply chain partnerships?
Well, hi everyone. This is Melissa Bouilly from Dell Technologies. I lead our supply chain sustainability group with primary focus. I've worked on things such as our conflict minerals area, social environmental responsibility in the supply chain, business continuity, program product security, and a wide variety of risk-based approaches to sustainability. When it comes to getting started, the way I like to think about partnerships in the supply chain is from that proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And in business, both are important. So I would never argue that everything is a collaboration or that everything is simply a competitive advantage or a differentiator. It's really a push and pull between those two approaches. So you don't need, and different kinds of partnerships really align with different kinds of approaches. So you don't need to sacrifice your competitive advantage to be part of industry partnerships and collaborative efforts. You just have to evaluate your strategy through that lens. A good example that I'll just bring up briefly is our ocean plastics packaging initiative. I think a lot of people understand that there's a major problem here. There are more than 86 million metric tons of plastic in the oceans right now. 8 million tons of plastic enter the oceans every year. So we identified this as an area that would be important to our customers and the planet. And on the one hand, we knew we'd like to be first to market. So that's where you go fast. So we started doing work in 2016 about how to utilize ocean plastics in our packaging. But at the same time, an ocean plastic supply chain didn't exist yet. So we also knew that we needed to go far. So what we needed to do there was we knew we weren't going to be able to solve this problem alone. Even though we are, the largest technology provider in the world, we alone can't use all that plastic. So we've partnered with the UN and a consortium, and really we're taking an open source approach to standing up the supply chain to encourage and enable the broad use of ocean-bound plastic. So that was sort of a good example where, on one hand, we were partnering not within our industry so that we could do a lot of the initial work and go fast and be first to market. But now that we've been first to market in ocean plastics, we've identified the need to go far. And so now we're partnering as broadly as possible, and we've committed to work with a cross-industry working group to stand up this supply chain and really try to scale it so that this kind of ocean plastic can be used across industries.
That's really interesting. I'd love to kind of come back to this idea of, number one, how you're actually choosing your partners with this ocean-bound partnership, and also the scalability aspect, which I think a lot of our listeners would be interested in hearing more about. Thanks for that, Melissa. Okay, perfect. Well, let's move on to the NGOs that we also have in the webinar today. Patricia and Jeff, welcome to the conversation. Patricia, from your side, what does the business case sort of look like for you?
Good morning and good evening, everyone. This is Patricia Jurewicz. I'm the Director of Responsible Sourcing Network, which I founded in 2010 as a project of As You Sow. And I've been focused on two main supply chains the last several years, one in the electronics industry leading all the way down to conflict minerals, and the other is the apparel industry and looking at human rights abuses in the cotton industry. And in regards to, I think it was a good partner, right, that I'm looking at right now. And if not, I'll answer another question later. But in regards to, how we look to partner with various companies, I would say that I'm looking for commitment, responsive, so that you have open communication, and willing to take action. We've done a number of projects or have advised to various projects in how to work through the supply chain and address those very egregious human rights issues, such as forced labor, worst forms of child labor, other human rights abuses. And it's not easy for one company to do that alone. And so looking at how we can both work with an entire industry or even multiple industries in some instances, as well as see individual action by companies. And I'll get more into this later, but how you can build trust between NGOs and corporations.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Patricia. Jeff, let's welcome you into the webinar. What are your thoughts there around what do you actually look for in a good partner, and how do you go about identifying one?
Thank you, Karina, and hello, everyone. This is Jeff Malcolm. I work at WWF based in Washington, D.C. And my role is in our private sector engagement team, where I work with companies to reduce impacts on the environment, both in their direct operations and their supply chains. Currently, I'm managing our partnership with McDonald's, but I've also managed our partnerships with Cargill, General Mills, and done projects with Walmart, Johnson & Johnson, and another of other companies over the 9.5 years that I've been at WWF. For those of you who don't know WWF, we're the largest environmental organization. We operate in over 100 countries, and we were founded in 1961. We are set up to really focus on particularly on wildlife, but we've realized over the years that our mission and our structure had to evolve in order to do that. So we've set ourselves up in what we call our goal teams. So if you think of wildlife being at the center of it, we also include the habitats where that wildlife could be, so that includes forests, oceans, and water. And then we include the issues or the drivers of things that can impact those wildlife in those places. So that includes climate change and food. And then we also work on things that we call our practices, which includes working on governance, on markets, and on finance. So those 9 areas of wildlife, forest, oceans, water, climate, and food, along with governance, markets, and finance, are where we really look to work and try to drive change. Now, for this specific discussion around partnerships, so we look for partnerships to be within those areas. So to your question about what makes a good partnership, first I would echo the comments of both Melissa and Marcel. I think they did a very nice job of identifying how you can think broadly about what are the issues and impacts that a partnership needs to help address. Right? I've often heard it described as understand your footprint, understand your handprint, the things that you touch, and then develop your blueprint. Right? So how do you go about developing that blueprint? And partnerships can be one part of that. Now, if you're going to have a partnership with someone, I think it's important, first of all, that you have the right partner. It's imperative that what the expertise you're looking for in the partnership, there's a good synergy and a symbiotic relationship between the two organizations so that they can work together. So for example, within WWF, we have a program called our Global Forest and Trade Network, where we work with companies on the sourcing of forest products. That is a strength of ours. That's something where we work with South Deforestation to enhance and promote better forest management practices. And so if you're looking to work with someone on forest, then I would hope that WWF would be in that, because that's an area where we have strength. So it's important to first have that right partner. I think the second thing is then also to ensure that you've got a shared strategy and shared outcomes that you're both driving for. Because within any partnership, you're going to have multiple goals, multiple ideas, and things that you could work on, but it's imperative to have those shared goals. So I would say have the right partner, and then make sure you've got a shared strategy and goals between the two organizations.
Thanks for that, Jeff. In terms of that sort of second point that you mentioned around the shared strategy and outcomes, thinking about the actual business itself that you work for, I mean, let's go back to this thinking and idea of how do you actually identify some of these areas and impacts of the business that actually need to change as sort of a first step. Melissa, can you sort of share some thoughts there?
Sure. So what we've done is we've conducted a materiality assessment across our footprint and our handprint in general, looking at the areas that supply chain can focus. But then we've also taken a risk-based approach, as Marcel had discussed, and really that's where you can find the business case very often, and it can take a little bit more work to find the business case in terms of sustainability, because sometimes it isn't as simple as just cost cutting, which is a very simple, dollars and cents business case. But sometimes risk management takes a little bit more effort to quantify and find the business case. One example would be where we've really focused on increasing our ranking in the Green Choice Alliance's Corporate Information Transparency Index, which is sponsored by the Institute of Public Environmental Affairs. This is an area where we work closely with our suppliers to address environmental risks. And this takes a lot of elbow grease on our part to go in, but really it takes us partnership in convincing our suppliers to make investments in their own environmental systems, management systems. And where we get the business case out of this is really reducing costs by promoting energy efficiency, reducing the likelihood of disruption due to factory shutdowns or permitting issues, violations. And really we had to get our leadership on board and get everyone rallying around the goal to improve our rankings in IPE, but then this became a win-win because it mostly just needed more work and more attention to details. So it's a situation where we had to get our suppliers to do work, and we needed a lot of internal buy-in to support everything that we're asking of our suppliers. And then over time, we've been able to really demonstrate the business case through energy efficiency, reduced water use, and a more stable and resilient supply chain.
And in terms of this sort of this idea of internal buying and really influencing internal stakeholders, which is one of the key themes for the webinar, what kind of worked for you in terms of being successful in that space?
Well, one of the things that we've done that's been really successful is implemented a very wide-reaching champions program across global operations, which includes procurement, manufacturing, and our supply chain. We did this by getting buy-in from our top leaders, and we're getting all of our sustainability scores on their own personal performance scorecards and cascading those goals throughout the entire organizations. Performance goals have to be embedded across the business. So, for example, we have a goal that 95% of our suppliers by spend will report GHG emissions and have active reduction targets. Now, I can't drive that goal alone because, frankly, I don't sign all of the checks to our suppliers. So we need all of our business leaders across the entire operational organization at the highest level bought into that goal. And then we need all of our global category managers trained on both the expectations and held accountable for them. So we do that through a champions program that is fully cascaded and embedded throughout our operations organization.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Melissa. That's really interesting. Marcel, I want to bring you back into the conversation to see if you've got anything to comment on in relation to what works and what's been successful in terms of influencing internal stakeholders there.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that you have a basic foundation in place. That means also what Melissa said, you identify your core programs. And what we did is for every program we have defined a KPI. And next to that we have identified the key stakeholders. And the stakeholders are addressed internally, but also identified the external ones, the ones that are direct in your sphere of influence and the ones that you just want to inform. Because that's the starting point. The risk of running a partnership is that you have too many people around the table and then you are moving in different directions without reaching the goal. And that's what you have to keep in mind. So keep track of where you start, who you engage with, and where you're heading to, like you do with normal business. And next to that, if you want to move forward, make clear that some of the projects are just to protect the brand, and other products can give you benefits in moving forward. And for example, what we started to do last year is we see suppliers much more now in building a sustainable partnership. In the past, we executed audits and we pushed the suppliers to do the corrective action plan, and then a certain time later we came back and we said, hey, you have to pass that audit again. And we are now transforming into a much more open dialogue, and what we want is that it is an equal based partnership, and where necessary we engage with local NGOs or local civil society in also opening up the gates of those suppliers, because what actually happens in some of what we called in the past risk countries is that a site actually saw us as a threat and also sees the outside world as a threat. And what we would like to is that not every supplier has a certain maturity level, and they also not always have all the wisdom in place. So what we want to do is that they share what are their threats, because for them it's important to build their local partnerships, because it's in the interest of the worker, it's in the interest of the business continuity, and that also supports then the whole business case. Because for a brand like Philips or any other brand, it's a risk if suddenly a supplier of yours is put at a media campaign or is put down by the local government because they're not meeting the local law. In that sense, it's a huge risk for you as a company. So if you have ways to see a supplier also as a partnership and engage or help them to engage with local society, then suddenly things are speeding up in a more structural way. And it also gives them trust back, which means you secure your business continuity. So that's one of the major changes that we are currently putting in place. So moving away from, of course, you still have cost reduction programs in place, but at the same time there are still a lot of opportunities to use the sustainable business case. And those things we see more and more examples of going hand in hand. And I think that is where we are now at a certain edge, and we are really moving into the right direction.
Excellent, that's really useful, Marcel. I want to go back to this idea of trust later, because I know, Patricia, you brought that up too. And we actually have a question that's come in from the audience that I'd like to pose to you. It's directed at Marcel. Just so the audience is aware, you can post questions to our speakers through the chat box on the right-hand side. So Marcel, the question that's come in from the audience says, you spoke of making sure that there aren't too many people around the table. How many exactly are too many, and what's the ideal number for a successful partnership?
Yeah, that's a fairly good question. So what we did is we identified 5 core programs, and for every program you have a different set of stakeholders. Just give you an example, if we talk about responsible sourcing, within responsible sourcing we have a few programs that we do together with different stakeholders. For example, we have a program that is called within the fund of child labor-free MICA supply chain. It's a fund organized by the Dutch government, and around the table we have a civil society organization. It's a global one. Then we have 3 small local civil society organizations. We have 2 brands, and we have 1 local authority. In another case, for example, we are a member of the EPRM, the European Partnership of Responsible Minerals. There you have a group which is managed actually by that partnership. So you have more difficulties to influence the number of partners around the table. And what then at a certain moment of time happens is that you have a chair with some representatives, in this case of NGOs, you have a representative of the brands. So then things are actually cascading in a certain direction, that your voice is being put forward onto the table. So it comes back to what I said earlier. If you have an interest and you have a close sphere of influence and you want to move things that are directly linked to your own operations, then it's a relative small group of stakeholders. If it is more through the whole value chain, then the group of stakeholders suddenly becomes much bigger, because else you cannot move things forward. I hope that answers the question.
That's excellent. Thanks, Marcel. That's really interesting. I'd like to move on to one of the things that's been brought up, one of the themes around building trust. Patricia, you mentioned that earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and how you can actually build trust in a supply chain partnership?
Sure. I'll speak to an example that I was involved with, which was once the Dodd-Frank law was passed, which included the conflict minerals section 1502 in it, the SEC reached out to ask for comment. And we had been part of a multi-stakeholder conference just a few months prior to that. Responsible Sourcing Network, together with BSR, gathered folks in Washington to start talking about conflict minerals because it was becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So we had already some relationship from meeting one another at that conference. And I appreciate some of the corporate partners gave the recommendation that maybe we put some recommendations forward in a multi-stakeholder joint comment rather than each stakeholder partner kind of commenting to the SEC on its own. And that led to, and it goes also to that question about number of partners, we had a very close-knit group, which was HP, GE, the Enough Project, and AMD, and myself got together and we went through a lot of the nitty-gritty negotiation, and it was good that we had such a small group really talking through all the issues. And once we figured out where there was partnership or where there was agreement, then we could go out to a wider group, and we each went out to our various stakeholders. I also work very closely with the Sustainable Responsible Impact Investment community. So we brought in investors, human rights groups, and corporations to say, hey, we've come up with these comments. Do they sound good to everybody? Can we get some sign-on? And that led to actually a couple, I think it was about almost 2 years of negotiation with the SEC, where we met with them in person. We gave multiple joint comments, and the SEC was really grateful that we were able to show them where there was, where we all agreed. What we didn't do was try to go too far in where we didn't agree. So that's where the various stakeholders could comment on their own. But we really focused on, that shared value that was mentioned earlier, and shared goals, and looking at where we did agree. And there was trust built over that time. I would say in the beginning, it really just takes time in understanding, where you can come together and where your shared goals and values are, and keep focused on that rather than the areas where you don't necessarily agree.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Patricia. We've actually got a question that's also been directed to you around this. The question is around how do you actually persuade, from a business perspective, for-profit companies to partner with NGOs or other for-profit companies hoping to make a sustainable impact? Have you found it difficult to get them on side with doing good?
Well, I think there's been a lot of evolution over the last couple of decades, and that we see where those shared goals and values are now. We all understand that we need a healthy planet, whether that be for raw materials being available, fish, and other raw materials. And I know Jeff could speak much more to that, as well as having a license to operate somewhere. If there's human rights abuses identified, or if the local communities see international corporations affiliated with those abuses, they're going to stand up against that. So we are seeing where it's in all of our best interest to work together. There's definitely different cultures and different mindsets within companies, how much they're willing to partner with an NGO. But I think as we have more conversations, whether that's at networking events or conferences, and see where there are those opportunities to work together, there's also quite a variety of NGOs out there. There are more campaigning groups that are going to make a lot more noise on the outside or with the public and consumers versus NGOs that are willing to say, let's figure out what the solutions are and let's work together to the solutions. Because if we do work together on these, there'll be better solutions than if we're each just trying to implement something on our own.
Thank you. Jeff, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think as we look at the different types of partnerships, it's important that we keep in mind who would be involved in it. So first, what I mean by that is, you have if we're talking about within a supply chain, first you've got the supplier and the business relationship to the purchaser. That is at the core of the supply chain engagement, and that relationship is critical to all of this, to implementing anything within your supply chain, whether it's a tier 1 supplier or if you go further down the supply chain. And so I think the first thing is you've got to recognize that has to remain in place. The way we've approached it at WWF is we always work with our partners to then work with them to engage their suppliers. And that might be through a supplier council or a supplier working group, some of the things that Marcel mentioned, that type of engagement. But we cannot, it's not something where a NGO, I think, should just suddenly start working with a tier 1 or beyond supplier without having the company there. Because both sides come to it with their own expertise and their own relationships, but keeping that relationship between the supplier and the customer is key. That can also help, I think, with the business case, particularly when we look at the long-term contracts. I think it's imperative that everyone keep in mind that as we look at the impacts of climate change, as we look at increased demand from emerging economies, there is the potential for the future to have increased volatility, increased competition, and increased scarcity. And so long-term contracts and understanding the different issues that you could be facing within your procurement are a way to help look at what the scope of a partnership could be about. I think also to further on some of these comments, if we look at another type of relationship where it's the business directly with an NGO, the key thing there is what is the expertise and what is your credibility? Because that is one way that you begin to establish trust, right? Is what you're saying factual? Is it science-based? Is it something that we can follow up on and actually see for ourselves? I think the second thing, which was touched upon, is the approach, right? How are you approaching working with the business? And it's important for it to be collaborative, and it's important for it to be constructive. That doesn't mean that a partnership is the same as a consultant relationship, because it's absolutely not. There are going to be areas where there are disagreements or we've got to sort of push back on each other, but how you approach that and do it in a professional way is absolutely critical to establishing and maintaining that trust.
Thank you, Jess. That was really useful. I'm going to bring up a question that we've had from one of the audience members, and it's been directed to Melissa and Marcel. The question is, once your supply chain partners have set goals, do you work actively with them to create a roadmap or plan, even if they don't know how to take this forward? So, Melissa, do you want to share some thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. It's a very important principle for Dell that we pair all of our goals and all of our expectations with capability building programs. And we also have on almost all of our initiatives, we have maturity curves identified. So we've got our scorecards, that rank our suppliers based on where they are on the maturity curve and how they're performing based on these goals. And then we also have the capability building so that really it's kind of a no excuse sort of situation where we are not just asking something from you, such as setting a science-based GHG emissions target or developing a responsible water risk mitigation plan, but we're also providing you intensive capability building programs to show you exactly how to do that so that everyone can succeed. We have, in 2016, more than 1,000 participants from 114 different supplier facilities participated in at least one of our training programs. And we saw, just as one example, that out of the facilities participating in one of our specific HR practitioner trainings, 71% of those facilities reduced their worker turnover rate. We've also have very intensive, as I mentioned, programs around water risk mitigation plans. We have, our goal is that 50 new facilities each year create a 5-year responsible water use plan. We're now on our 3rd year of that, so we'll have up 150 facilities with water use plans. And we don't just ask them to create a water use plan and identify areas to reduce water. We also call them into in-person trainings and teach them exactly the expectations in a partnership with an NGO, the expectations for how to reduce water, how to use it responsibly, and then we provide feedback on those plans and provide constant sort of reinforcement and feedback on how they're performing to those plans. So it's a true partnership on not just setting the expectation, but then also partnering on how to achieve what we're looking for.
That's great, thank you. And Marcel, for you, the same kind of question. Do you work actively with your supply chain partners to create a roadmap or plan?
Yeah, what we do is we have an annual process in place, and the annual process requires our suppliers to complete a self-assessment, provide a lot of supporting evidence. What we do then is we validate that kind of information either as a desktop validation or on-site. And for all the suppliers, we define, based on the input they provided, a kind of draft improvement plan. And the draft improvement plan is not just quick fixing things, it's really about raising the maturity level, it's really about the long-term thinking, and it's customized. So we make for every supplier an individual improvement plan. And what we do is it's all about expecting small improvements, but also respecting the supplier. Respect that every supplier has a different maturity level. We have, for example, a completely different supply base than Dell. We have a lot of small, medium business already in our tier 1. And that means they not always have the resources in place. They not always have the awareness, the knowledge. So you need to treat those kind of suppliers completely different than a large site which is part of a multinational organization which has already a long existing sustainability program in place. And that's what we did, is we said we need to treat every supplier as being unique. We are at a comparable level, and we accept that everybody has a different organizational maturity level, but also different maturity level on sustainability. And with some suppliers, we implement monthly KPI tracking. With others, we have on-site trainings. We help them in moving from creating policies or implementing procedures up to developing feedback loops or corrective action plans. As what we want is that it is becoming part of their daily operations. And that's seeming to be very successful because we can measure on an annual basis how they progress. For us, it's not about black, white, you meet or you comply with the code. For us, it's about, okay, we agree together on what steps are you going to take and what is it that you're going to commit to in the next 12 months or in the next 36 months. And we measure on that. We measure on progress and we measure on performance. And that's part of the business negotiations as well. So you cannot lack we want you to move forward, but at your own speed, within your own priority, and that's been perceived as very helpful from the procurement point of view at our side, but even more from the supplier point of view. They see it as really, again, collaborative instead of punishment.
Thanks for that, Marcel. We've got a question that's actually relevant to all of our panelists today. But Marcel, while we're with you, if you'd like to probably answer this first. The question is, have you found that you are reaching out to partners with your proposals more, or are NGOs reaching out to you trying to align their mission with yours?
In general, that counts for every stakeholder dialogue that you have, and that's also learning, and that's really important to everybody who's listening. The challenge is in the beginning to make sure that everybody understands from each other, but also speaks out to each other. What is it that you bring to the table, and what is it that you want to get out of it? And it takes a lot of time to get that clarity on the table, because it's all about the definition. Because if a company says, I want to have an impact, and an NGO or a CSO says, I want to have impact, that not always means the same. So really, an advice that I would like to give, and that's also a learning that we have faced, it is about taking the time to understand the perception, but also the definitions of all the parties around the table. Because if you do not spend enough time in discussing that in the beginning of any dialogue, it's a huge risk that your collaboration will fail. And that's pity, because in the beginning you have the time, and you should take the time. We say always, think slowly, act fast, and that's really an advice that I would like to share.
Thanks. Melissa, any thoughts there?
Well, I would say that it's a good mix of whether or not we reach out and initiate partnerships or we are reached out to, but I think the core element here is for us to ensure that our partnerships are absolutely aligned to our corporate strategy. So for example, we have corporate goals around promoting women entrepreneurs, promoting transparency in the supply chain, and promoting youth development. So we have very active partnerships in those areas. And while many NGOs and many companies and foundations are doing incredible work across all different kinds of areas, it's important for us that we focus our efforts on areas that we've decided to make the largest impact. So that's just sort of how we choose which partnerships to enter into and who to partner with.
Thanks. Patricia, Jeff, what do you think? Do you think there's a good kind of mix between the two?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think it can be challenging, because sometimes I think that the NGOs might have their ear closer to the ground and hear of the difficulties that local communities are going through, or where the challenges are. And a lot of times we're the ones who bring them forth to companies, to investors, to others, to ask them to do something about it. And sometimes it's challenging to have a company listen to what you have to say, or to be willing to take action on it. I know there's a lot of issues being presented to companies today, so it's hard to decide which one to go forward with. And over time, certain projects gain momentum. I've also seen where companies maybe don't want to take action alone, so either they're looking for their trade association to get involved, or maybe a small group of companies. And I think it is a balance between, how many companies do you need to take action or to partner with, similar to what was being, Marcel was discussing earlier about how many people to have around the table, because I have seen where you can act faster and go ahead and maybe do a pilot project or something with just a smaller group, and then expand it out. And we're looking to do something like that now in the middle of the supply chain, which I think is always, can be somewhat of a black hole, but is taking lessons learned from what has been done in implementing due diligence with the smelters, We're seeing where we can apply that now to cotton yarn spinners, and I think it could be applied to other commodities as well. But it's a bit of a dance sometimes to figure out how to move forward.
Jeff, do you want to comment on anything?
Sure. I think what I would say is first I would echo the comments of Marcel, Melissa, and Patricia as well. All of these comments have been great. You know, it is absolutely imperative that you spend time discussing what the objectives are and how you're going to work together at the beginning, particularly with the larger groups, sort of multi-stakeholder groups, because you will have multiple interests there. And it's important that everyone ensure that it is aligned to their own strategy and their own mission, as Melissa was saying. The only thing I would add is from WWF's perspective, we are a mission-based organization. We are not changing our mission just because there is someone who wants to work with us on a particular topic. We have companies and organizations that we want to work with and partner with, and we do pursue them. We do have companies come and talk to us as well, but really we have gone through the process of defining what our outcomes or goals are and how we want to work with different organizations. I think the good news for the other thing to point out for the question is there are a lot of different nonprofits out there, and so most topics are going to be covered by at least one nonprofit or multiple nonprofits. So the ability to partner or work with someone who is credible and has some experience across the different fields of human rights, labor rights, supply chain issues, environmental issues, deforestation, water risk. There's a number of groups out there that can do this, and so I think in many ways you've got a sort of menu of nonprofits that you can choose from.
Excellent, thank you. And in terms of, I guess, with your experience of partnering with various corporates out there, and this is a question that's just come in from the audience, which is more around the communication side of things. The question is really around how do you find the best ways to communicate about these partnerships? To really sort of showcase successful storytelling that shares the great messages and their approaches to it.
So at WWF, we are transparent about all of our business partnerships. We publish an annual report which discloses all of our partnerships. That is just part of being a nonprofit and being transparent. So I would say in most situations, particularly for the nonprofits that are listening in the audience, it is very good to be transparent about your relationships with business. The other thing I would say is that storytelling is absolutely a great way to get the message out there. Conferences, in particular, can be a good way to reach new audiences. But there's got to be a sort of shared communication, and they need to be credible communication. So it's important to make sure that you have a good outcome that you can talk about before you go too far down the road of being too proactive on the communications. I think what we typically try to do is some communications around the beginning to make announcement, to bring awareness to it, but then really spend time working together in that partnership to get those outcomes, and then the storytelling can really flow from there.
Thanks, Jeff. Anyone else wants to kind of comment around what makes successful storytelling and communications? I guess that's anyone? I guess that's a no then. Right, well, we'll move on to our final theme before our time is up, and the final theme is really around really kind of looking into the future and understanding what these impacts of the partnerships are. I'd like to start off first from the corporate perspective, so Marcel and Melissa, around how are businesses forecasting future positive impacts on their industry and society and environment through supply chain partnerships. Marcel, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I think the challenge is to make it measurable. So what is the result or the impact that you can achieve with any partnership that you're going to do? the thing that we notice is that if we compare to, let's say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we have increased the number of partnerships. And that also has to do with the maturity level that we as a company have achieved. At a certain moment of time, you have control about your own operations, you have control about your strategic suppliers, your tier ones, but the challenges are going upstream your supply chain. And you are not strong enough to influence or to change certain elements in there. So it is becoming more and more important that you tie up with all those partnerships. And the biggest challenge is to decide which partnership fits best to your corporate, to your program, but also which partnership is an industry initiative that you just join and you follow because it's in the nature of the industry, and you move things forward and you benefit from that total package, or where is still the opportunity to differentiate. And what we notice is that there are too many initiatives. That's one point that I see happening that could be benefit from already existing schemes or initiatives out in the world. So the challenge actually is, what can industries learn from other industries? Because in theory, the supply chains, if you peel it down into the basics, they are more or less the same, whether you talk about a food supply chain or electronic supply chain or an automotive supply chain. But they still have their differences. But some are more advanced in tackling problems through the partnerships they have developed a long time ago, where other industries could benefit from. And I think that is, for me, when I look, let's say, to the next 5 or 10 years, that is where we start to think about is, what can we learn from other industries to make things happen, or to have that wider impact. And especially when we're moving into a more circular based economy, it is going to be more important to look outside your own industry, and that's where partnerships are becoming more and more important in moving the needle.
That's excellent. Thank you, Marcel. Melissa, over to you. How are you forecasting positive impacts of these partnerships, and particularly with reference to the scalability that you mentioned earlier on in the conversation?
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree with Marcel. I think of partnerships as on sort of a scale spectrum. And on one side, you've got something in any kind of initiative or action you would like to take related to sustainability or just as a business. On one side of the spectrum, you've got things where you would like to be the 100% innovator. You would like to maybe have a patent, have complete competitive advantage. And in that case, your partner and your impact is going to be very specified or very specialized to possibly groups that have very extreme specialized knowledge, niche information, and then you're going to bring impact through that innovation sort of channel. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got where you really want industry-wide adoption. And what this does is it lowers costs. An example I'll use, kind of in line with what Marcel was saying, is recently the Responsible Business Alliance has expanded its operations. They moved from just being the EICC, the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition, to a broader Responsible Business Alliance, where companies outside of the electronics industry are getting involved. And this is something that can benefit across multiple industries and companies, because from our perspective, if we could get every manufacturer in the world to adopt the RBA audit, that would dramatically reduce our costs related to audits and turnover and violations and all of those things. So there, the impact's going to be far-reaching, and that's why we drive a broad partnership, so that it would increase the likelihood that when we identify a new supplier that we want to bring on, that they're already going to be talking the same language and understanding our expectations. So that's really, when I think of impacts, I think of them as, where do we want to have just an extreme innovation impact versus where do we want to have an industry-wide impact?
Thanks for that. Let's end with you, Jeff and Patricia, around this question of how are you forecasting future positive impact on industry, society, and environment? Patricia, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks. You know, I've been participating with the OECD and their due diligence for responsible supply chains now for both minerals and textile footwear, and I think that the approach is really great. It's aligned with the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. We're seeing the Sustainable Development Goals really rally people around a couple of main core focus areas. And I know we've been talking quite a bit about collaboration, but I also think it's that collective leverage. Melissa and Marcel were both speaking to it. When you can really get the entire industry or even a group of industries rallied around and taking action together, it's where you can really make a great impact going forward. But along those lines, I think it is important for companies to use that leverage and not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And I know storytelling came up. You don't want to see it either perceived or actually be greenwashing. You want to see the action behind the words and the goals that are set out. And so companies have to be willing to, you know, cut off a partnership with a supplier if that supplier continually is not implementing the goals that are set forward. And that's what I mean by really walking the walk of saying, you know, we're all in this together, but if you're not willing to go that direction, then, you know, we're willing to separate that relationship. And that's where I think the NGOs will then understand that the companies are not just always putting money first, but are taking the bigger holistic picture into mind.
Excellent. That's really, really great. Thank you. Jeff, do you want to add anything else to that?
I'll just say, and I'll do this quickly because I'm cognizant of time. At WWF, our goal with partnerships is to help advance our goals. So at the beginning, I mentioned that we are organized in these 6 goal teams of wildlife, forest, oceans, water, climate, and food. At the end of the day, all of our partnerships will be evaluated based on what sort of impacts they can drive in those areas. So this is about saving endangered species, stopping deforestation and forest degradation, advancing sustainable fisheries and saving mangroves, advancing water stewardship, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing food waste, and advancing a food system that allows humanity to thrive and live in harmony with nature. That's how we look at our partnerships, and at the end of the day, that's what this is all about for WWF.
Perfect. Thank you. Right, now before we close, I just wanted to ask the panelists one more question, and it's your number one top tip when it comes to revolutionizing your supply chain partnerships. So, Marcel, do you want to start off your top tip to the audience?
My top tip is have an open and honest dialogue and respect each other in order to build trust and to move the needle forward.
Excellent. Melissa?
I think that the top tip would be to identify partners that share your core values, and because then you'll be able to develop longer-term partnerships and more wide-reaching.
Excellent. Patricia?
I'd say be willing to push the limits and take some action and risk, and find partners who are willing to do that with you.
Excellent. And lastly, Jeff?
I would say begin the conversation with your suppliers and with potential partners immediately. This is very, very urgent, particularly when we look at the challenges that we're all going to face in the future.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion today. I'm afraid time has now run out. So everyone who signed up to the webinar will receive a recording of today's webinar. And if your questions weren't answered, you can raise this with our speakers and 400 others who will be joining us at the 6th Responsible Business Summit in New York, taking place in March on the 26th and 27th in New York next year, and also via our hashtag RBSNY. So please do visit www.events.ethicalcorp.com/RBSNY for the full speaker lineup and agenda. Thank you everyone today for the audience and the wonderful panelists, and we hope you enjoyed the discussion.